Jonathan Roumie walked into the federal courthouse that Tuesday morning with fire in his eyes and evidence in his briefcase that would change everything. What happened next left Roy Moore completely speechless and may have just exposed the biggest judicial scandal of the decade. The 43-year-old actor and civil rights advocate had been battling this 67-year-old former Alabama Supreme Court justice for months over voting rights violations in Texas. Everyone expected another typical legal proceeding. Nobody expected Roumie to drop a bombshell that would make Roy Moore like someone who was unprepared on national television. Before we dive into this explosive story, hit that like button if you're ready to see justice served. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these incredible political showdowns. Trust me, you're going to want to see every second of what Jonathan Roumie did to this arrogant judge. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Camera crews from major news networks had positioned themselves strategically around the gallery, sensing this might be more than just another routine hearing. Roy Moore, notorious for his theatrical entrances, had swept into his courtroom at exactly 9 a.m., his black robes billowing behind him like some kind of dark cape. He settled into his elevated chair with the smugness of a man who had never been seriously challenged in over 2 decades on the bench. Civil rights activists filled the front rows, many wearing t-shirts with voting rights slogans. Legal observers from various bar associations had notebooks ready, expecting to document another example of judicial overreach. Court reporters adjusted their equipment, not knowing they were about to record one of the most explosive judicial confrontations in modern American history. But all eyes were on Roumie as he organized his materials at the attorney's table. His navy blue suit was perfectly pressed, his briefcase methodically arranged, and his expression was that of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. He had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence that would not just win his case, but potentially bring down one of the most corrupt judges in the federal system. Roy Moore glanced at him dismissively, the way he had looked at countless attorneys who had dared to challenge his authority. He adjusted his reading glasses and shuffled some papers, putting on his usual show of judicial importance. The man had built his reputation on intimidating lawyers, especially women and minorities who came before his bench. He was confident this would be just another easy victory. What he didn't know was that Jonathan Roumie had been recording conversations, collecting documents, and building a case against him that would make Watergate look like a parking ticket. The evidence in his briefcase wasn't just about voting rights. It was about judicial corruption at the highest levels, and he was about to expose it all in front of a packed courtroom and live television cameras. This wasn't just another court hearing. This was about to become the most viral judicial clapback in modern American history. And Roy Moore was about to learn that you don't mess with Jonathan Roumie without bringing receipts. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why this battle matters for every American who cares about voting rights and judicial integrity. Roy Moore represents everything wrong with the old boy club in the federal judiciary. At 67 years old, he's been on the bench for over 2 decades, appointed during a conservative administration with a track record of blocking voting rights expansions. He grew up wealthy in Alabama, went to elite law schools, and has never had to worry about voter suppression affecting his community. Moore has a reputation for arrogance that's legendary among Alabama lawyers. He talks down to attorneys, especially women and people of color. He's known for making snide comments and acting like he's doing everyone a favor just by showing up to court. Multiple bar associations have filed complaints about his conduct, but nothing ever sticks because he has powerful political connections. The judge thinks he's untouchable. He's used to intimidating lawyers who come before his bench. He especially enjoys putting young, ambitious attorneys in their place. In his mind, the courtroom is his kingdom, and everyone else should just bow down and accept whatever he decides. But Jonathan Roumie is not your average attorney. The 43-year-old actor from New York, turned civil rights advocate, came from humble beginnings and worked his way through life, building a career fighting for justice before stepping into the political arena. He's a former public defender who knows what it's like to fight for people who don't have a voice in the system. Roumie has been challenging voter suppression laws across Texas for years. He's won major victories against gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and polling place closures that disproportionately affect communities of color. He doesn't back down from fights, even when facing powerful opponents who think their positions make them immune from accountability. More importantly, Roumie does his homework. He comes to every battle prepared with facts, evidence, and legal arguments that are absolutely bulletproof. He's made a career out of exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable. whether they're judges, politicians, or corporate executives. The stakes in this particular case couldn't be higher. And at issue is a Texas voting law that would close dozens of polling locations in predominantly Black and Latino communities while keeping suburban locations open. The law also requires additional ID verification that civil rights groups argue is designed to suppress minority turnout. Roy Moore had already indicated in preliminary hearings that he was likely to uphold the law. Legal observers expected him to dismiss Roumie's challenge and rubber stamp another piece of voter suppression legislation. The judge seemed confident that his usual intimidation tactics would work on this civil rights advocate, just like they had on countless other attorneys. What Moore didn't know was that Roumie had been investigating him for months. He had uncovered evidence of judicial misconduct that would blow up his entire career. He had documentation of backroom deals, political pressure, and ethical violations that proved this judge was anything but impartial. This wasn't just about one voting rights case. This was about exposing a corrupt system where judges make decisions based on politics instead of law, where powerful interests get special treatment, and where communities of color are systematically denied their fundamental rights. The federal courthouse in downtown Dallas was buzzing with anticipation that Tuesday morning. Civil rights groups had organized supporters to fill the gallery. Legal reporters from across the country had flown in to cover what everyone expected to be a routine but important voting rights hearing. What made this case even more significant was the timing. With midterm elections approaching, voting rights cases were becoming flashpoints for national political battles. Conservative groups were pushing for stricter voting laws they claimed would prevent fraud, while civil rights organizations argued these same laws were designed to suppress minority turnout. Roy Moore had become a key figure in these battles. His court had consistently upheld restrictive voting laws, often using legal reasoning that legal scholars found questionable. Civil rights attorneys suspected he was coordinating with political operatives, but proving judicial corruption is notoriously difficult. Federal judges enjoy lifetime tenure precisely to insulate them from political pressure, but that same protection can shield corrupt judges from accountability. Roumie's legal team had been investigating Moore for over a year, following a pattern of suspicious rulings that seemed to align perfectly with partisan political goals rather than legal precedent. They had hired private investigators, analyzed phone records, and even planted sources within political organizations to document the connections between the judge and outside interests. The breakthrough had come 3 months earlier when a disgruntled political operative approached Jonathan Roumie's office with recordings and documents proving the coordination. The evidence was so damaging that Roumie's team spent weeks verifying every detail, knowing they would get only one shot at exposing the corruption before Roy Moore and his allies could cover their tracks. Nobody knew they were about to witness judicial history in the making. The confrontation began the moment Jonathan Roumie stood up to present his opening arguments. Roy Moore, sitting behind his elevated bench in his black robes, immediately tried to establish dominance with his usual condescending tone. "Mr. Roumie," he said, drawing out the title like it was something distasteful, "I hope you understand that political grandstanding has no place in my courtroom. We deal with law here, not campaign speeches." The gallery stirred uncomfortably. Reporters looked up from their notebooks, sensing tension. Roumie, dressed in a sharp navy suit with his briefcase open on the attorney's table, didn't flinch. He had been expecting exactly this kind of disrespect. "Your Honor," he replied calmly, "I'm here to present legal arguments supported by constitutional precedent and documented evidence of voting rights violations. I believe that's exactly what this court is designed to address." Roy Moore leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing across his face. Several lawyers in the gallery exchanged glances. They had seen this routine before. The judge would spend the next hour trying to intimidate and belittle any attorney who dared challenge his authority, especially if they happened to be a woman or a person of color. The gallery was filled with tension as observers recognized the familiar pattern. Young law clerks whispered to each other, having heard stories about Moore's reputation for judicial bullying. Veteran civil rights attorneys clenched their jaws, remembering their own humiliating experiences before this same bench. Some had been held in contempt for far less aggressive advocacy than what they were witnessing. Court security officers shifted uncomfortably near the doors, sensing the electric atmosphere. The usual decorum of federal court proceedings was already beginning to crack under the weight of anticipation. Several reporters had their phones ready, knowing that whatever was about to unfold would likely make national headlines within hours. Roy Moore adjusted his reading glasses with theatrical precision, clearly savoring what he expected to be another easy intimidation of a presumptuous attorney. He had perfected this routine over decades. The condescending tone, the dismissive body language, the implied threats about legal careers. It had worked on countless lawyers before, and he saw no reason why it wouldn't work on Roumie. Evidence? Moore said with a dismissive laugh that echoed through the marble-columned courtroom. From what I've seen in your filings, Mr. Roumie, you're relying more on emotional appeals and political talking points than actual legal precedent. Are you sure you're prepared for a real legal argument? Or should we reschedule so you can bring a more experienced attorney? The insult was deliberate and calculated. Moore had researched Roumie's background and knew he had extensive courtroom experience. But he was betting that public humiliation in front of cameras would rattle his confidence. He had used similar tactics to break other high-profile attorneys who thought they could challenge his authority. What he didn't realize was that every word he spoke was being carefully documented, not just by court reporters, but by Roumie's legal team for use in future misconduct proceedings. His pattern of discriminatory treatment toward women and minority attorneys was about to become evidence in a judicial conduct investigation that would destroy his career. The insult hung in the air like a slap. The gallery was dead silent. Civil rights activists in the front rows clenched their fists. This was exactly the kind of judicial arrogance they had come to expect from Roy Moore. But seeing it directed at a high-profile advocate was still shocking. Roumie set down his pen and looked directly at the judge. His voice remained perfectly calm, but there was steel underneath. Your Honor, I've been practicing civil rights law for over 15 years. I've argued cases before federal courts across this country. I'm fully prepared to present my arguments if the court is prepared to listen to them. His response was measured and professional, but everyone in the courtroom could hear the steel underneath. Roumie had faced down hostile judges before, but he had never faced one with the level of corruption he was about to expose. His legal team had coached him extensively on maintaining composure during what they knew would be an unprecedented judicial confrontation. Behind his calm exterior, Roumie's mind was racing through the evidence he had spent months organizing. The phone recordings, the email chains, the witness statements, everything was meticulously cataloged and ready for presentation. He had practiced this moment dozens of times in mock courtrooms, anticipating every possible response from Moore. His senior legal advisor, sitting in the front row of the gallery, gave him an almost imperceptible nod. This was the signal they had agreed upon, the moment when he would transition from defensive responses to full offensive attack. The preliminary sparring was over. It was time to deploy the nuclear option. Oh, listen, Moore replied, his condescension now completely unconcealed. His voice carried the arrogance of someone who had never been successfully challenged in his own courtroom. But I have to say, Mr. Roumie, your track record in this court doesn't inspire confidence. Your previous filings have been, shall we say, less than persuasive. The judge was referring to 2 previous voting rights cases where he had ruled against Roumie's arguments, dismissing them with barely concealed contempt. What he didn't know was that those cases had been strategic preliminaries, opportunities for Roumie's team to study his judicial patterns, document his bias, and gather intelligence about his decision-making process. That was the moment when several things happened at once. Court reporters leaned forward, sensing this was about to become more than a routine hearing. Photographers in the press section quietly adjusted their camera settings. Civil rights activists pulled out their phones, ready to document whatever was about to unfold. Roumie opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Your Honor, before we proceed with today's arguments, I need to address something that directly relates to this court's ability to render an impartial decision in this matter. Roy Moore raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon. I'm questioning this court's impartiality, Your Honor, and I have documentation to support that concern. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. This was not how federal court hearings were supposed to go. Attorneys didn't challenge judges directly like this, especially not in open court with reporters watching. Moore's face began to redden. Mr. Roumie, I strongly advise you to reconsider whatever path you are about to go down. Accusations against sitting federal judges are serious matters that can have serious consequences for the attorneys who make them. But Roumie was just getting started. He pulled a document from his folder and held it up. Your Honor, I have here a record of communications between this court and political operatives regarding pending voting rights cases, including this one. The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. Roy Moore gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "That's enough," he barked. "I will not tolerate baseless accusations in my courtroom. Bailiff, prepare to clear the gallery if necessary." "These aren't baseless accusations, Your Honor," Roumie continued, his voice growing stronger. Jonathan Roumie reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, his hands steady as the weight of the moment settled in. "I have emails, phone records, and witness statements documenting inappropriate communications between this court and outside political interests. I have evidence of predetermined outcomes and coordinated strategies to suppress voting rights in communities of color." Roy Moore shot to his feet, his face now bright red. "Mr. Roumie, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. I suggest you sit down and confine your arguments to the actual legal issues before this court." "The legal issue before this court, Your Honor," Roumie fired back, "is whether you can render an impartial decision when you've already coordinated with political operatives to ensure a specific outcome." The courtroom was electric now. Everyone could feel that something historic was happening. The usual rules of judicial decorum were being shattered in real time, and nobody quite knew what would happen next. Roy Moore pointed a shaking finger at Roumie. "You are out of line, Mr. Roumie, completely out of line. I have been on this bench for over 20 years, and I have never been subjected to such disrespectful, unfounded accusations." That was when Roumie smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting months for exactly this moment. "Your Honor," he said, his voice now perfectly steady, "would you like me to read some of these communications out loud, or would you prefer to address them privately first?" The silence that followed was deafening. Roy Moore stood there, mouth slightly open, clearly realizing that he had walked directly into a trap. The congressman wasn't making wild accusations. He had actual evidence, and he was prepared to use it. What happened next will go down in legal history as one of the most devastating judicial exposures ever captured on camera. Roy Moore, thinking he could intimidate Jonathan Roumie like he had countless other attorneys, was about to learn that this advocate had come to his courtroom locked and loaded with evidence that would end his career. Roumie reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a tablet. The entire courtroom watched in complete silence as he wiped through screens, selecting specific documents. Roy Moore remained standing behind his bench, his face cycling through emotions from anger to confusion to what looked like the beginning of genuine fear. "Your Honor," Roumie said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who held all the cards. "On March 15th of this year, you received a phone call from Marcus Thompson, Chief of Staff for the Texas Secretary of State's office. Would you like me to read the transcript of that conversation?" Roy Moore's face went pale. "I don't know what you think you have, Mr. Roumie," he stammered. "But I have the actual recording, Your Honor," Roumie interrupted, holding up his tablet. "Mr. Thompson called your chambers at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Your clerk wasn't there, so you answered directly. The conversation lasted 11 minutes and 37 seconds. The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. Reporters were furiously typing on their phones, sending alerts to their newsrooms. This was no longer a routine voting rights hearing. This was a federal judge being exposed for corruption in real time. That's impossible," Moore stammered. "Judicial communications are privileged," he added weakly. "Not when they involve coordination with political operatives to predetermine the outcome of pending cases," Roumie shot back. "Not when they involve discussions about how to legally justify voter suppression, and definitely not when they involve promises to political allies about how you'll rule on specific cases." Roumie tapped his tablet again. "Would you like me to play the audio where Mr. Thompson tells you exactly how the Secretary of State's office wants you to rule on this voting rights challenge? Or should I skip to the part where you promise to take care of the Roumie problem once and for all?" The silence in the courtroom was so complete you could hear the air conditioning humming. Roy Moore gripped his bench so tightly his knuckles were white. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. "Cat got your tongue, Your Honor?" Roumie asked, and there was no mistaking the triumph in his voice now. "Because I've got plenty more where that came from." He pulled out a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. "These are printouts of text messages between your personal cell phone and various political operatives over the past 18 months. Messages where you discuss pending cases, share confidential information about legal strategies, and coordinate timing for your rulings to maximize political impact." Roy Moore finally found his voice, but it came out as a croak. This is highly irregular. These materials should have been presented through proper channels." You mean the proper channels where corrupt judges protect each other? Roumie's voice was rising now, and every word carried the weight of 15 years fighting injustice in courtrooms across America. The proper channels where complaints disappear and whistleblowers get silenced. Those proper channels, Your Honor. The judge tried to regain some authority. Mr. Roumie, I'm ordering you to— You're not ordering me to do anything, Roumie exploded, his voice echoing through the courtroom like a thunderclap. You lost the right to order anyone around the moment you decided to turn this courtroom into a political operation. The gallery erupted in applause. Civil rights activists jumped to their feet, cheering and whistling. Court security looked around nervously, unsure whether to intervene. The reporters were going absolutely crazy, knowing they were witnessing the story of the year unfolding in real time. But Roumie wasn't done. He held up another document, his voice cutting through the chaos. This is an email from your personal account to a political consultant sent just 3 days ago. You want to know what it says? Roy Moore looked like he was about to pass out. His face had gone from red to pale to gray. He slumped back into his chair, no longer even trying to maintain the pretense of judicial authority. Roumie read from the document. The Roumie hearing is Tuesday. Don't worry, I'll shut him down fast. These civil rights lawyers think they can come into my courtroom and make demands. I'll show him who's really in charge here. The voting law will be upheld, guaranteed. The courtroom exploded. People were shouting, phones were flashing, and reporters were literally running toward the exits to file their stories. Through it all, Roumie stood at the attorney's table, calm and composed, watching Roy Moore realize his career was over. Your Honor, he said, his voice cutting through the K, I move for your immediate recusal from this case and any other voting rights matters. I also move for a formal investigation into judicial misconduct based on the evidence I've presented here today. Roy Moore tried one last desperate play. This is a setup. These documents are fabricated. This is a political hit job. Roumie smiled that same cold smile from earlier. Your Honor, every document I've presented has been verified by independent forensic experts. Every phone recording has been authenticated by multiple sources. Every text message comes with metadata showing timestamps, cell tower locations, and device information. She paused for dramatic effect. And every single piece of evidence will be turned over to the appropriate authorities for criminal investigation of judicial corruption. That was the moment Roy Moore knew he was completely and utterly destroyed. The man who had spent decades intimidating attorneys, suppressing voting rights, and abusing his position of power had just been exposed as a corrupt political operative by a civil rights advocate who had done his homework better than any lawyer he'd ever faced. The viral moment came when Roumie looked directly at the judge and delivered the line that would be replayed millions of times on social media. Your Honor, you called me a liar, but the only person who's been lying in this courtroom is you. And now the whole world knows it. The delivery was perfect, calm, measured, but with an unmistakable tone of finality. It was the kind of line that would be turned into memes, quoted in legal textbooks, and remembered as the moment when judicial corruption met its match. Social media managers across the country were already preparing to clip and share the footage. But Jonathan Roumie wasn't finished with his destruction of Roy Moore. He pulled out one final document from his briefcase, holding it up for the cameras to capture. Your Honor, this is a financial disclosure form you filed last year. Would you like to explain why you failed to report the $50,000 consulting fee you received from the same political organization that's been coordinating with your office on voting rights cases? Roy Moore's face went from gray to green. Financial disclosure violations were federal crimes that could result in immediate removal from the bench and potential prison time. The man who had spent his career sending others to jail was now facing that same possibility. That's the form was completed by my accountant, he stammered, but his voice was barely audible. The fight had completely gone out of him. 20 years of judicial arrogance had been destroyed in less than an hour by an advocate who had come prepared for war. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause, gasp, and chaos. Photographers' cameras flashed rapidly, capturing the moment of complete judicial humiliation. Court security looked nervously between the judge and the gallery, unsure whether to maintain order or simply let history unfold. Roy Moore put his head in his hands, finally understanding that his career was over and his freedom was now in jeopardy. The most powerful person in that courtroom had just become the most powerless. And Jonathan Roumie, the man he had tried to intimidate and dismiss, was standing victorious with evidence that would end his career and possibly send him to prison. The explosion on social media was immediate and devastating. Before Roy Moore had even left his courtroom, Jonathan Roumie exposes corruption was trending nationwide with over 100,000 tweets in the first hour. The video clips of his humiliation were spreading faster than wildfire across every platform. Within minutes of the confrontation ending, the courthouse steps were packed with reporters, shoving microphones at anyone who would talk. Civil rights activists were giving impromptu interviews about what they had just witnessed. Legal experts were already calling it the most significant judicial corruption exposure in decades. The footage was incredible. Multiple news organizations had captured the entire confrontation from different angles. The moment when Roy Moore's face went pale after Roumie mentioned the recorded phone call was being shared millions of times. The clip of him slumping in his chair when Roumie read his email was becoming an instant meme. But the most viral moment was Roumie's final line. "Your Honor, you called me a liar, but the only person who's been lying in this courtroom is you, and now the whole world knows it." That clip alone racked up over 2 million views in the first 3 hours. Twitter exploded with reactions from across the political spectrum. Progressive activists were calling Roumie a hero and demanding similar investigations of corrupt judges nationwide. Conservative legal scholars, many of whom despise judicial activism, were actually praising him for exposing corruption that undermined confidence in the entire federal court system. A prominent civil rights attorney tweeted, "Jonathan Roumie just did what we've all wanted to do for years. Expose these corrupt judges who think they're above the law. This is what accountability looks like." The tweet got 50,000 retweets in 2 hours. A conservative legal commentator posted, "I disagree with Roumie on most issues, but corruption is corruption. If he has evidence of judicial misconduct, every American should support investigating it. The integrity of our courts matters more than partisan politics." Even that got 25,000 likes from people across party lines. The memes were brutal and hilarious. One showed Roy Moore's shocked face with the caption, "When you try to intimidate an advocate, but he comes with receipts." Another paired his slumped posture with, "When you realize your corruption just got exposed on live television." The creativity was endless and merciless. Major news networks interrupted regular programming to cover the story. Legal analysts were calling it a watershed moment that would force a nationwide examination of judicial corruption. Political commentators were debating whether this would spark a broader movement to investigate federal judges who had made questionable rulings. The immediate fallout for Roy Moore was swift and brutal. By evening, 3 different judicial oversight organizations had announced formal investigations. The Department of Justice issued a statement saying they were reviewing the allegations and would take appropriate action based on the evidence. His political allies, who had protected him for years, suddenly couldn't distance themselves fast enough. The Texas Secretary of State's office issued a statement claiming they had no knowledge of any inappropriate communications and were cooperating fully with all investigations. Politicians who had praised Moore in the past were deleting old social media posts and refusing to comment. But the impact went far beyond one corrupt judge. Legal scholars were already calling this a turning point in judicial accountability. Law schools announced they would be using the case as a teaching example of both judicial misconduct and effective legal advocacy. Civil rights organizations began organizing campaigns to investigate other judges with suspicious patterns of rulings. The evidence Roumie had presented was so comprehensive that it raised questions about how many other judges might be engaging in similar corruption. If one advocate could expose this level of misconduct with proper investigation, how many other federal judges were making decisions based on political pressure instead of legal precedent? Within 48 hours, Roumie was being invited on every major news program in the country, but he was strategic about his media appearances, choosing to focus on the broader issues rather than just celebrating his victory over one corrupt judge. "This isn't about me versus Roy Moore," he told one interviewer. "This is about a system where too many judges think they can ignore the law and serve political masters instead of the Constitution." What happened in that courtroom should be a wake-up call for every American who cares about justice. His message resonated across party lines. Even Republicans who opposed him on most issues were praising him for exposing corruption. A conservative senator issued a statement saying, "Regardless of party affiliation, corruption in our judicial system threatens the foundation of our democracy." Jonathan Roumie deserves credit for bringing this evidence to light. The legal implications were staggering. Every case Roy Moore had decided over the past several years was now subject to appeal based on judicial misconduct. Hundreds of rulings could potentially be overturned, affecting everything from voting rights to criminal convictions to civil lawsuits. Defense attorneys across Texas were filing motions to have their clients' cases reviewed. Prosecutors were scrambling to figure out which convictions might be thrown out. Civil rights organizations were identifying which voter suppression laws might now be vulnerable to successful challenges. The political implications were equally significant. Roumie's exposure of judicial corruption gave Democrats a powerful talking point about Republican attempts to pack courts with partisan judges. But it also forced both parties to confront the reality that judicial corruption was a bipartisan problem that required bipartisan solutions. Progressive activists began organizing campaigns to investigate federal judges appointed during previous conservative administrations. Conservative legal organizations started calling for investigations of liberal judges who might be engaging in similar misconduct. The entire federal judiciary was suddenly under scrutiny in a way it hadn't been for decades. The economic impact on Roy Moore was immediate and devastating. His speaking fees, which had earned him hundreds of thousands of dollars in supplemental income, dried up overnight. Law firms that had hired him for consulting work terminated their contracts. Even his country club membership was under review. More seriously, the FBI announced they were opening a formal criminal investigation based on Jonathan Roumie's evidence. If convicted of judicial corruption, Moore could face years in federal prison and the loss of his judicial pension. The man who had spent his career sending others to prison was now facing that possibility himself. The story became a case study in how one person with courage, preparation, and evidence could take down even the most powerful corrupt officials. Legal advocacy groups began using Roumie's approach as a template for challenging other questionable judges and officials. Law schools started teaching courses on judicial accountability, using the Moore case as an example of how attorneys could effectively challenge judicial misconduct. Young lawyers were inspired by seeing someone stand up to a corrupt judge and actually win. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the message it sent to other corrupt judges and officials. Someone is watching, someone is investigating, and someone is prepared to expose you if you abuse your power. The era of judicial immunity from accountability was ending, and Jonathan Roumie had fired the first shot. Social media continued buzzing for weeks afterward. Justice for all became a rallying cry for judicial reform. The Roumie effect started being used to describe other instances of officials being held accountable for corruption. The Advocate had sparked a movement that extended far beyond his original voting rights case. The voting rights law that had started the whole confrontation was immediately put on hold pending the investigation of judicial misconduct. Other similar laws across the country faced new challenges as attorneys used Roumie's tactics to investigate the judges who had upheld them. 3 months later, Roy Moore announced his retirement from the federal bench, citing personal reasons. Everyone knew the real reason. He was trying to avoid criminal prosecution by giving up his position. But it was too late. The investigation continued, and criminal charges were filed 6 months after his retirement. Jonathan Roumie, meanwhile, became one of the most sought-after speakers in the country. His story of standing up to judicial corruption inspired a new generation of civil rights lawyers and political activists. He had proven that with enough preparation, courage, and evidence, even the most powerful corrupt officials could be brought down. The judge who had tried to intimidate him was now facing prison time. The voting rights he had fought to protect were being restored, and the system of judicial corruption that had operated in the shadows for decades was finally being exposed to the light. But Roumie knew this was just the beginning. There were more corrupt judges to investigate, more voter suppression laws to challenge, and more powerful interests to expose. He had won this battle, but the war for justice and accountability was far from over. And that's exactly how he wanted it, because Jonathan Roumie had never been interested in just winning one case. He was interested in changing the entire system, and his destruction of Roy Moore had given him the platform and credibility to do exactly that. The story of what happened in that courtroom became legend. It was the day an advocate brought receipts so devastating that they ended a judge's career and sparked a nationwide movement for judicial accountability. It was the day corruption met its match in the form of a prepared, fearless advocate who refused to be intimidated. And it was the day America remembered that no one, not even a federal judge, is above the law when someone has the courage to hold them accountable. Thanks for watching this incredible story of justice served and corruption exposed. If you want to see more stories like this, where powerful officials get held accountable and underdogs fight back against the system, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because trust me, there are plenty more corrupt officials out there who need to be exposed. And we're going to cover every single takedown. See you in the next video, where we'll dive into which corrupt judge might be next on the chopping block.